when you talk about Islam, a good example of this is the Muslim Brotherhood. Its earliest proponents, like Al-Afghani, he was pretty clearly a British agent. He was very into pushing the British imperial mandate of what they called at that time a pan-Arab alliance, and the idea was to create an Islam that Britain could control. So I don't believe that like radical Islam is an invention of the British Empire. I think that Islam has always been radical, and that's a position that I think
we all agree on that very much.
I've learned more about. Like 10 years ago, I didn't know much about that, but I've gotten deeper into that. But I think Al-Afghani and his coterie underneath him were all very suspicious, and it makes perfect sense why the British Empire wanted to do that, and it had to do with the Ottoman Empire, the challenge that they had. And as the Ottoman Empire waned, you had the Sykes-Picot Agreement where they divide the Middle East up according to British and French plans. So the idea was if you could control Mecca and Medina, and this is why I think I mentioned this maybe you in passing on Twitter or something, maybe it was a year or so ago. It may not have been you, I don't remember, but I said something about al-Husseini, the guy that was the Grand Mufti. That was the British imperial creation. And the reason that I said he worked for British intelligence was because even after he had gotten in trouble and fled to Germany and ended up back, I think, in the UK, he was openly working for British intelligence, MI5. And I can give you all the sources for this stuff. Now, whether that means that he was always in that capacity, I don't know. But I think he ended up being a useful agitation tool that the British eventually had a handle on. And again, that makes sense with what the British wanted to do in these regions. So I'm not saying that everybody's a spy or that everybody's controlled, but there are key figures that are, like St. John Philby. He becomes Salafi. That's a suspicious conversion. Did he really believe that stuff? Or was he just working on behalf of the British Empire? You know, T.E. Lawrence, he's gay. He goes in, he does all these operations. He helps set up, the Sauds as basically controlling Saudi Arabia. Gertrude Bell, she's another British spy. She goes in, she sets up Iraq, basically.
So the Mufti Husseini, he was brought to his position under the guise of, or under the pretense or the reasoning that the Brits had to jump in and fix something because something with the succession of the next Mufti went wrong. So they appointed him to fix that, but it wasn't really a good solution. Eventually, they had to supposedly on the surface punish him for his extreme attitudes and his association with radical Islamic violence against Jews and all of that, and then they had to kick him out of there, and then he ended up becoming a friend of Mussolini and of Hitler, who then promised him that he would be Hitler's number one guy, and they would together, once they're done with the Soviets and the Brits, they would then together take out the Jews, and he would be the number one representative of the Arabs and Muslims and all that. So there's some really, really crazy stuff going on if you want to go into the...
Now, my source on this is the Royal Institute for National Affairs. They have a researcher who I think is just a good geopolitical researcher. You can take issue with his politics. I don't agree with all of his politics, but it's a really important book called Secret Affairs, Britain's Collusion with Radical Islam. It's very well sourced. And his argument is that towards the end, in 1946, Husseini began to work for the British once again after all of the BFF with Himmler. Sources suggest that he was employed by the Arab News Agency, originally set up by MI6 as a front in Cairo to spread British propaganda in the region. This is what becomes Al Jazeera. So MI6 actually set up Arab News, which becomes Al Jazeera. So this is also the shady origins of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hassan al-Banna was, again, like another one of these figures who didn't seem to take Islam that seriously. He was a secular...
But would you agree that it was basically like the British, it was more like, instead of playing a long game by the British, it was rather just a tool, as you just earlier mentioned, to kind of mess with the Ottoman Empire and to take it down, and then to kind of assert control in the region through these means. But they only used what was already available, so they didn't really create the whole Islamic radicalism, Islamic terrorism.
No, I agree with that. So I'm just saying that the organization called Muslim Brotherhood utilized the ideology of a radical Islamic sort of cover veneer, even if the Al-Afghani and al-Banna themselves didn't actually believe it. So yes, there was already radical Islam for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, today, I mean, this book even has a really good critique of like the billions of dollars. So he wrote this book for the Royal Society back in 2010. And even back then he was talking about how just Saudi Arabia, for example, has put, I think, like $50 billion up to 2010 into promoting Islam in the West. So that would include schools, radical mosques. So this is not a person pro-Islam. He's very critical of the establishment's usage and attempt to sort of steer it. But his argument at the very beginning, and it's the same argument that Dreyfus makes in his book, Devil's Game, he argues that the idea was the British Empire early on, that if you could create a Mecca and a Medina underneath British control, as the Ottomans waned, the British Empire could control Islam. And then you would have massive, power. And
that sure went very well. Yeah.
I think this also explains why you have, even today, Prince Charles, King Charles, he has this ongoing fascination, not just with all religions. I know he's kind of a perennialist, but
people say he's secretly a Muslim or something.
I looked into that, and all I could find was that he's been given awards from different Sufi groups and orders, and he's given money to Sufi orders, but I couldn't find any hard evidence that he actually was inducted into any Sufi orders, or he could be a secret, Muslim convert or something. But he definitely favors the perennialism of Sufism and to some degree Islam. But I'm just saying he's a reflection of this. Game of Nations, Miles Copeland. Everybody should read this because he was CIA's liaison to Egypt under Nasser and Syria under, I think, Assad's dad prior to that. But he talks a lot about how the West wanted to utilize the big T. And he talks about them, particularly on page 204, as being really useful idiots. And I'm not saying that the West is always behind big T, but that by admission, in many cases, he says it's very useful. So I think it's just the realpolitik that goes on, that all governments will at times resort to these kinds of things. They'll resort to fake flag events, shall we say. They'll resort to arming, Operation Cyclone is the arming of the Taliban, right? The Afghani freedom fighters. Brzezinski goes on CBS and says, "That's your land over there. God is with you." Telling them to go and essentially fight the Soviets. And that plan actually worked, right? That exhausted the Soviets during the Cold War. And then you had this creation of this entity, this army that the CIA and the Saudis had put billions of dollars into, that then was able to, to whatever degree we think they're allowed, or I tend to think that they were a problem allowed to be. An arc of crisis model is what Brzezinski talked about after the Cold War. And I think that narrative explains a lot of what happened post-Cold War better than the narrative that, the mainstream media promoted. For example, weapons of mass destruction, all of that. I think that was a lie. And so I think there's a power block usage of a lot of these radical Islamic groups, and exactly which groups and exactly how far, I think, can be debated. But maybe that's what and I'm not trying to be argumentative, but I think that's another issue that you felt was too far.
No, I mean, I had only an issue with when it comes to, for example, arguing that that Western intelligence or Israeli intelligence was directly involved in the creation of certain terrorist organizations that we have today in the most direct form. I would agree. For example, we know very well that that during the Cold War, the U.S. unfortunately utilized Islamic terrorism to use them to fight against the Soviet Union. We know that the other side engaged in similar things as well. We know that this was a big game that was being used before the world became more familiar with Islamic terrorism. And I would agree, for example, that as a result of these idiotic games, two of the major Islamic terrorist organizations developed because of this, as a direct consequence of this. Mm-hmm. I would only disagree when if we are then going to argue that the intelligence organizations in question were directly involved in creating these modern terrorist organizations, such as Al Qaeda or ISIS. So I would say Al Qaeda and ISIS were directly a direct consequence of these idiotic and pretty vile games. But were they directly involved in creating and upholding and funding these organizations? I would dispute that.
Well, maybe there the question becomes, what do we mean by direct? Because I would agree that you didn't necessarily have, Brzezinski or Kissinger flying over there and literally telling Osama bin Laden what to do. But you had essentially an alliance of Western friendly groups and intelligence operations, including CIA, Saudis, Pakistani, Egypt, all working together to arm and to train militarily some of these outfits. So maybe bin Laden it would be too far to say, oh, bin Laden is a CIA operative, but he's definitely somebody who had a close relationship with the CIA. And even after the Taliban had, in the 1990s, bombed the coal, they'd done the Yemen bombings that bin Laden was taking credit for. You had meetings in Texas with certain oil entities like Unocal to ensure that there would be a pipeline set up. So I think that even these things that we think of as like terror events, they can actually be useful for certain military industrial complex profit motives, like the establishment of a pipeline. And you may take issue with this as well. It's fine, but you see a very similar thing with a lot of what's going on with Turkey and Syria and Russia.